Hey, it's me again. Haven't been recording for a few weeks because I've had a bit of a cough, and my incessant coughing wouldn't have been very good for lecture recordings. I'm mostly better now. I might cough a few times during this talk, but I think I can make through it without too much interruption. Anyway, here I am, and in this talk I'm going to be discussing thinking versus feeling when it comes to how people process and respond to messages in the media. Now, this idea of thinking versus feeling might remind you of a popular discussion about people's thoughts, which talks about System 1 versus System 2 thinking. This has appeared in a lot of popular press and popular books. If you're not familiar with System 1 and System 2 thinking, I'm going to go over them briefly. So System 1 thinking has characteristics of being fast, more unconscious, more heuristic, meaning that it relies on simple rules of thumb or quick judgments. And it's also sometimes emotional when people respond to information emotionally and make decisions based on emotion. That can be said to involve System 1 thinking. On the other hand, System 2 thinking is kind of the opposite. It's slow, it's more conscious, it involves cognitive effort, it's more systematic in that same way, and it's rational where people are considering different options and really thinking about what potential outcomes there may be depending on their decision. When people make decisions on such rational bases, they're using System 2 thinking. Now you'll notice I use the word thinking to describe System 1 and System 2. And this talk is about thinking versus feeling. I would like to say it's a bit of a false dichotomy to pit thinking versus feeling, because when we do respond to our emotions, when we are letting our feelings affect our decisions, well, of course there's thinking involved, there are thought processes. But when I'm talking about thinking versus feeling, here the thinking is more of this System 2 type that is a lot more cognitive. Now, System 1 and System 2 thinking is good to think about when considering how people approach different scientific issues and how they come to form beliefs about those issues and express their beliefs and make decisions about their behaviors, so on and so forth. And one of the great contexts in which to study how people's thoughts versus feelings affect their beliefs and decisions is in the context of controversial science. Controversial science often involves a lot of feelings. People get entrenched in really strong positions, but they're also often quite rational about their positions. They have specific reasons why they believe in their position. Whether or not there's a scientific basis of that position is up for debate, but they do have very specific reasons for those beliefs. So they tend to employ both System 1 and System 2 thinking. And so how can people get engaged in science and engage in science from a consensus viewpoint when maybe their existing orientations, their existing values are standing in the way of that engagement? Well, one great example of how some of these orientations can be overcome and people can engage with a scientific issue and come to scientific terms with it is in the context of climate change. And in fact, one set of researchers found that belief in scientific consensus is somewhat of a gateway belief, where as soon as people come to agree or come to acknowledge that the vast majority of experts on climate change agree that it is happening, well, they're more inclined to look into the facts and come to the belief also that, yeah, climate change is happening, humans are causing it, there are these specific sources of climate change that are human caused, and this makes a lot of sense because humans like to hold accurate beliefs. So belief in scientific consensus and acceptance of scientific facts are not two distinct ideas, but they tend to coincide. And certainly if you talk to people who really accept the scientific facts, yeah, they'll believe there is consensus, but belief in consensus can be used as a communication strategy to get certain segments of the public on board with specific ideas about controversial science. So Lewandowski et al. In 2013 did an experiment. And in this experiment, they were interested in how different messages affect belief that humans are causing global warming. And they created a couple different stimuli. There was a control, sorry, not a couple different stimuli, a couple different conditions. There was a control condition that didn't have a stimulus, no message at all. They were simply measuring certain beliefs that the participants held, and then measuring their belief in anthropogenic climate change. Then there was a consensus condition in which participants were presented with a basic statement and a graph to visualize the degree of scientific consensus about climate change. Now, something else that they measured among both groups, and this was in a survey before the experimental manipulation, was their endorsement of a free market. And they were able to determine if people have low endorsement or high endorsement of a free market. And the idea is people who endorse a free market believe that, or tend to believe that, companies should be allowed to operate however they can to make a profit, which it might include emitting a lot of carbon dioxide, as long as that's what the market supports. If down the road consumers decide that they are opposed to that, well, then market forces will ultimately affect the behaviors of companies. Companies should be left free to do what they want within the market, no regulations, right? And so you would expect in the control condition, which was essentially just correlating these market endorsements with belief in anthropogenic global warming, that those with low free market endorsement, those who don't think the markets or that businesses should be free to do whatever they want, tend to believe in climate change more than those with high free market endorsement. And in fact, that is what the results showed. This is not surprising. There's this particular value orientation, this set of beliefs that tends to lead individuals to a certain perspective on climate change. But very interesting, when they presented the simple message about consensus, the belief in global warming was not different between the two groups. So somehow just presenting this idea of scientific consensus motivates individuals to, or it taps into individuals' motivations to hold accurate beliefs, and it increases the belief in anthropogenic global warming among those whose value orientations might have otherwise inclined them away from that. And so the basic idea is that if climate scientists think this is happening, if almost all of them think it's happening, then it probably is, and it probably is a problem, and so maybe it's okay to believe that climate change is happening while also supporting this notion of a free market. But then there was another study that took this a step further. So van der Linden and collaborators were interested in also in presentations of consensus. And they did a very similar experiment where some participants saw a message about consensus and other participants didn't. And they found, very much in replication of that previous study, that messages about consensus affect the perceived agreement that scientists are in consensus, which affects belief in human causes. And so this is very consistent with the previous finding that believing in consensus leads to belief in specific aspects of the science behind climate change. But they took this one step further, showing that it also affects support for action. Now, if we think to the previous study, those with high free market endorsement, right, who really think that companies should be free to do whatever they want, well, if they believe humans are causing climate change, maybe they'll be more open to certain regulations. Maybe they'll support things like carbon cap and trade that reduce the free market, that constrict the free market, but also are combating this issue that 97% of experts say is happening and is human caused. And something else very interesting that this study did is they used metaphors. And I think this is kind of critical because it shows that the way scientific consensus and scientific information is communicated really matters. And so the way they communicated about consensus, well, I'll give you one example, one of their metaphors. They, they had statements like, or questions, thought experiments like, if 97% of engineers said a bridge was unsafe, would you feel confident to cross that bridge, right? And so they put this idea of 97% of experts into contexts or into situations that individuals could relate to, where the decision might have more direct personal bearing, and it gets audiences, or it gets the recipients of these messages really to understand what 97% of experts means. Okay, so this brings me to this idea of the role of science communication. And there's an argument about this. Should science communication simply be working to fill a knowledge deficit because maybe people aren't buying into certain scientific ideas simply because they don't know enough? Or there's a separate perspective, a related perspective, saying that yes, people need to engage with knowledge, but they're really only going to connect with the knowledge that they're oriented to. So the idea that knowledge affects beliefs really depends on people's orientations. And so that is a contextual aspect of this deficit perspective. And this is important because people need to engage with scientific knowledge. They need to build scientific knowledge, but also they need to see the relevance of that knowledge, and they need to see how it impacts their lives and understand why they should pay attention and why they should use that in making their decisions. And so that's why the contextual perspective is important. And there's scientific evidence showing the importance of understanding audiences' orientations. I'll give you an example from another experiment by Mayer and Tormala. This study was interested in promoting blood donation, and there were a couple conditions. First, there was a message that essentially led with, I feel blood donation is the right thing to do because yada, yada, yada. And then there was another condition saying, I think blood donation is the right thing to do because yada, yada, yada. And then, before being exposed to these messages, participants were measured for their affective and cognitive orientations. Now, the way the researchers did this is they had participants answer semantic differential scales. These are scales with negative and positive adjectives on either side of the scale, and then participants indicate their beliefs about a specific idea between those adjectives. And so, looking at this list of adjectives, how do you feel about blood donation? And so those with an affective, with a positive affective orientation, tended to say that it's calming, pleasant, nice, comforting, painless. I don't think that many had a positive affective orientation. And then the cognitive orientation, those who believe it's beneficial, wise, valuable, useful, necessary. Now, of course, these are only the positive adjectives from those scales. And then where the respondents scored donating blood, the researchers were able to determine if they were more affective in their orientation or more cognitive in their orientation. And these findings aren't going to surprise you at all. If I asked you to draw these out in your prediction, I think you'd get it spot on because with the I feel message, I feel blood donation is the right thing to do, those with an affective orientation were more affected than those with a cognitive orientation. And when the message started with, I think blood donation is the right thing to do, well, the effect was the reverse. Those with an affective orientation were less influenced than those with a cognitive orientation. All right, and so this really shows that the types of information and the arguments, the scientific arguments that audiences are willing to listen to, has a lot to do with how those messages orient to their state of thinking. Right? And there's a good reason for this. We like to focus on information that is relevant to us because it's easier for us to process. And we like this kind of information. We like approaching those types of stimuli because we are cognitive misers. This means we don't like to expend any more energy than is necessary. This doesn't mean we don't like to use our brains. All it means is that when we use our brains, we try to do so as efficiently as possible and not waste any cognitive energy. And I guess that's a good thing, certainly not a bad thing. And this has implications for how people process information that they encounter in media messages. In fact, this research paper by Annie Lang in 2000, well, she presented this model. It's the limited capacity model for motivated mediated message processing, the LC4MP. 4MP, right. Okay, good. And, well, while I was trying to remember what that abbreviation stands for, if you had raised your hand to ask me a question, well, I wouldn't have responded because this is a recording and I'm not aware of you right now. I'm sorry. I perfectly value you and I'm happy you're watching, but I'm not aware of you. But if you were in this room with me and you tried to get my attention, okay, that would be reasonable, but I might not pay attention because I was so caught up thinking about what LC4MP stands for. And that's what this model is all about. So the idea of the LC4MP is that we have cognitive capacity. These are our mental resources, which we have to divvy up among different cognitive activities that we, that we employ when processing messages in the media. And some obvious ones are encoding. So when we encounter messages, our sensory systems, our eyes, our ears, that information needs to be somehow converted into signals that our brains can process, and that requires mental energy. And after encoding, we store some of that information in memory, and storage requires some cognitive resources. And then there's retrieval, which is when we draw on our memories to use what we know to make decisions in the future, or sometimes we use it to assist in the encoding process. Anyway, the point is we have limited cognitive resources that we must split among these different cognitive processes that are used when we process messages. And there's a lot of research showing this, that by increasing the cognitive demand of one task, maybe retrieval, it interferes with other tasks like storage or encoding, and vice versa. And so it's important to know that, yeah, we can only process so much information at a time, and we can only retrieve so much information at a time, and so relevant information ends up being the most attractive and most useful to audiences of messages. Now, there's a well-known model, the elaboration likelihood model, that kind of demonstrates how people process information partly as a function of how much energy they're willing to put into it. And so this model, the elaboration likelihood model, is interested in how stimuli lead to certain responses. Messages lead to new thoughts or new behaviors or new attitudes, right? And so there are a couple different ways. This is what's called a dual process model, by the way. You can think of it kind of like system 1 versus system 2, saying that there are two distinct pathways that lead from a stimulus to a response. The first one is the peripheral pathway. According to this, when people are employing the peripheral route processing, they're really only paying attention to superficial attributes of a message. So maybe the source of the message really influences their evaluation of the message, irrespective of the message's contents. Or the appearance of the presenter. This happens in television. There are all these superficial factors that are largely unrelated to the contents of the message that people can use as heuristics of a sort to make quick judgments about the merits of the message. The other route, oh, by the way, the peripheral route is aligned somewhat with system 1 thinking. It's fast, it's efficient, it doesn't necessarily lead to long-term attitude and belief change. The other route, which is similar to system 2 processing, is the central route. And central route processing involves more focused attention on the contents of the message, really picking apart the language and arguments to make a very informed decision. Of course, this route takes a lot more cognitive energy, and people aren't going to employ it unless they're motivated and able. Certainly they need to be motivated. They need to want something out of that message that a peripheral cursory review won't give them. But then they also need to have the capability to elaborate and to think or to think deeply about the message and break it down into its constituent components. And so I'm going to present one final study. This is by Lazard and Atkinson, 2014. I published with Lucy Atkinson in 2014. She was very prolific that year. But she did a really cool study with Lazard looking at message elaboration in the context of recycling promotion. And so they created a couple different messages to promote recycling behavior. One was a text-based message, just text saying, this is why you should recycle, here's how you can do it, good job, people. And then there was an infographic. Now this is interesting because if you read up on the elaboration likelihood model and a lot of the research that has derived from it, visual information is often regarded as a peripheral cue because people can very quickly evaluate visual information. We're able to quickly make snap judgments based on pictures. You know, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and so very often visual information is regarded as part of that peripheral route processing. But infographics are a special type of visual. I mean, they're graphics in that they're visual, but then they convey a lot of information, which is why they're called infographics. And so something else that they were interested in, like the other studies I presented, they measured something about the participants. And these, by the way, are called covariates, which they used to test whether the effects of the manipulation depended on certain orientations, right? So in this study, they were interested in visual literacy. They looked at individuals with high and low visual literacy. And if you look at how they measured this, you might think, hey, that's kind of like media literacy, which I've talked about in some of my other recorded lectures. And indeed, you would be right. Visual literacy is a component of media literacy. It's very much the visual component of media literacy. So individuals with high visual literacy probably have high media literacy. And so when they are elaborating about messages, you might expect those with greater visual literacy just elaborate more on account of them having greater media literacy. And indeed, you find this for the text-based message, where those with high visual literacy elaborated more. They really thought more about the elements of the message than those with low visual literacy. But with the infographic, there wasn't a difference. And this is kind of the same pattern that I've been showing from all these studies. All of these studies show that the way information is presented can overcome people's orientations, people's preferred modes of thinking, and lead to very similar outcomes in terms of how people process information. In this case, somehow the infographic gets people with low visual literacy to think more about the information it's conveying. And that's interesting because people with low visual literacy shouldn't be as capable of processing visual information, which is a big part of what infographics are. But infographics are so much more than that. And so in this talk, I made a few points, obviously, made a few points. What it all comes down to is that really the way messages are presented can affect how different audiences connect with those messages. And certain techniques, things like metaphors, things like infographics, can be really effective for convincing people to look beyond how they feel about an issue and think a little bit more, elaborate a little bit more about it. And so that's all I wanted to talk about in this lecture. Thank you for watching.